Okay, I did actually rename my talk slightly. It's not the byways of science anymore. It's the cart with legs and other curiosities. So I'm starting with Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys became a Fellow of the Royal Society on the 1st of March 1665. And we're very lucky to have his impressions of the meeting when he was admitted, which he recorded in his famous diary. And he wrote, "This day I did pay my admission money, 40 shillings, to the Society. Here was very fine discourses and experiments, but I do lack philosophy enough to understand them, and so cannot remember them. Among others, a very particular account of the making of the several sorts of bread in France, which is accounted the best place for bread in the world." So although it's very brief, Pepys's account highlights two of the things that I'd like to talk about today. The first is the subject matter of the meetings in the early years of the Royal Society. As we've just heard, the thing that stuck in Pepys's memory was the account of bread making in France, which John Evelyn actually gave to the Society that day. And this is not necessarily a subject that we would think of as being scientific today. But in this talk, I'd like to introduce some of the other subjects that the Royal Society were actually very interested in at the time, and talk about why they might have been important for the Society's program in the early days. The second point I'd like to make about Pepys's account is that he lacked philosophy enough to understand the rest of the meeting. The minutes for that meeting actually record that there was an experiment which tested whether sulphur was able to burn without air, which was performed at the meeting. But clearly Pepys had perhaps forgotten that that happened, or didn't really understand it at the time, and so he didn't write about that in his diary. Pepys was, of course, an intelligent and a dynamic man, and was later elected president of the Society. But he was not a trained scientist. Indeed, very few of the early fellows were what we would think of as scientists. Most were trained as clergymen, physicians, merchants, lawyers, or they were not trained at all and they were merely gentlemen. What set them apart from most of their fellow citizens was their fascination with the world around them, and their belief that it was possible to observe and explain how nature worked. Although it was not always easy for them to explain their ideas to the outside world, and in fact they were sometimes mocked for doing useless experiments, I will argue that the early society depended on and welcomed the involvement of ordinary people. As you may already know, the Royal Society for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge was founded in 1660 by a group of men who'd been meeting for some time before this at Gresham College in London. They'd been meeting informally to discuss the new philosophy, the new experimental philosophy. Historians prefer to use these terms, experimental philosophy or new philosophy, rather than science, because science was not actually a word that was used in that way at the time, and so we prefer to use the current terms. Science really didn't gain that meaning until later on in the 18th century. Put simply, the new or experimental philosophy was the belief that much more could be discovered about the natural world than was currently known, and that this process of discovery should take place through close observation and experiment rather than arguing over theoretical hypotheses. This belief had been given a huge boost by the invention and improvement of two instruments in particular, and they were the telescope and the microscope. And I've got a slide here of Hooke's microscope, which he bought from an instrument maker in London. These instruments allowed ordinary gentlemen to see for themselves two completely new worlds in a way that had previously been unimaginable. The first of these new worlds was the moon, which was described in print by Galileo in 1610, and the second was the microscopic world of mould, lice, nettle stings and bacteria, which was displayed for the first time in Robert Hooke's Micrographia, which was printed in 1665. This is one of the most famous illustrations from the Micrographia, which was the flea which Hooke managed to draw himself with amazing description of the flea there. Samuel Pepys actually pre-ordered his copy of Micrographia And when it came out, he sat up until 2 a.m. reading it. And he called it the most ingenious book that ever I read in my life. Pepys himself had bought a microscope from Richard Reeve, a London instrument maker, in August in 1664. So that was actually sometime before he became involved with the Royal Society. And he paid the sum of £5 and 10 shillings for it. And to put that into context, he later, I think, gave his wife £30 per year for her clothing. So the sum of £5 was a large sum, but it wasn't an unusually large sum. Having bought it and read Henry Power's book on microscopical observations, Pepys and his wife sat down together to try out the microscope. And he noted, "My wife and I, with great pleasure, but with great difficulty, before we could come to the manner of seeing anything, at last did, with good content, though not so much as I expect when I come to understand it better." Pepys's interest in this new technology and his optimism about his own capabilities was shared by many early fellows of the Royal Society. Some of them, like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, had been involved in chemical, physical and medical experimentation for some time, and these fellows were keen to carry on the avenues of research that they'd already begun. Others, though, brought very little experimental experience to early meetings. So what was the attraction for these men? I think that the answer was partly a boundless curiosity about the natural world, and the belief, like Pepys's, that everyone could make a contribution to this new endeavour. This attitude is summed up in the first official history of the Royal Society, which was printed in 1667, which is only 7 years after the foundation of the Society. As the early publication date might suggest, it was more of an apology than a history, and it was aiming to allay contemporary fears that the new philosophy was dangerously subversive and might undermine religion and lead to anarchy. The book was probably a rather collaborative effort by several fellows, but it came out under the name of Thomas Sprat. As well as emphasising the usefulness and practical benefits of the Royal Society's work, the book also makes some comments about how this work should be done and by whom. The Society, Sprat claimed, would be well served by plain, diligent and laborious observers, who, though they bring not much knowledge, yet bring their hands and their eyes uncorrupted. He gave the example of the Society's growing collection of rarities, which had been donated not only by the hands of learned and professed philosophers, but from the shops of mechanics, from the voyages of merchants, from the ploughs of husbandmen, from the fish ponds, the parks, the gardens of gentlemen. So he was giving this image of the Society as somewhere that everyone could actually come and contribute something to. And we can argue about the degree to which the early Royal Society lived up to these claims, but their professed ethos was one of inclusiveness and communal endeavour for the good of all sections of society. So the point was that not only could you as a mechanic or a merchant bring something to the society, but that in the fullness of time the society would actually be able to benefit you in some way as well. So perhaps they would be able to introduce a better way of doing things into your kind of trade, or improve the roads in London or something like that. The way forward was through plain, diligent and laborious observation of every imaginable feature of the natural world. Sprat claimed that there were only two subjects the fellows would not touch, and these were God and the soul. In all the rest they wander at their pleasure. And in the remainder of my talk today, I'm going to follow them in some of their wanderings. And I've deliberately chosen examples of research which may seem slightly unusual to us today. And I've done that in order to emphasise the breadth of the early Royal Society's research program. I think it's important that we remember that the early Royal Society was not just investigating gravity and the longitude problem, but they had a huge range of ambitions for their research program, and in fact it's impossible really to encompass those in the space of half an hour. because they're very diverse and surprising. So although God and the soul were prohibited, this actually left quite a wide field open for investigation, basically every aspect of the natural world and human endeavour. The early fellows were particularly conscious of the need to establish what was already known in order to verify truths, discard misconceptions, and then begin the task of building a firm foundation for new truths that could be discovered. The new philosophy brought with it a new insistence on record keeping, minute taking, and archiving of correspondence. And that's really the reason that we're able to do these kinds of studies, because all those minutes and archives have been kept, and fantastically they're all available to us now in this amazing library. So we're very thankful for that. The fellows felt that there were two ways to find out what was already known. The first was to read as many books as possible, and the second was to ask as many questions of as many different people as possible. We can see evidence of their reading program in the libraries assembled by the Society and by individual fellows, and also in the many book reviews which were published in the Philosophical Transactions or read out at meetings. For information not available in print, elaborate series of questions were constructed and sent to the men who were most likely to be able to answer them. These questions could be very particular, such as the list sent in 1664 to Sir Filiberto Vernati, who was living at the time in Batavia, which is now Jakarta in Indonesia. Vernati was asked more than 30 questions about the minerals, vegetation, fauna, weather conditions, geography, and human inhabitants of the East Indies. And he responded very diligently, among other things, informing the Society that the papaya tree only bears fruit if male and female trees are grown together, and that it was unheard of in those parts for diamonds and other precious stones to grow again after 2 or 3 years in the place that they'd been previously dug out of. Printed accounts of early journeys through Asia and the New World were extremely popular, and I've put out here one of those, which is Samuel Purchas's Purchas His Pilgrims, which is a collection of travel narratives printed in 4 large volumes in 1625. The unreliability of these previous reports is highlighted by some of the questions asked of Vernati. For instance, this is one question he was asked: whether in the island of Sombrero there be found such a vegetable as Master James Lancaster relates to have seen, which grows up to a tree, shrinks down when one offers to pluck it up into the ground, and would quite shrink unless held very hard, and whether the same, being forcibly plucked up, hath a worm for its root, diminishing more and more according as the tree grows in greatness, and whether the same, plucked up young, turns by the time it's dry into a hard stone, much like white coral. Rather unsurprisingly, Vernati's response was, "I cannot meet with any that ever heard of such a vegetable." And similarly, in answer to the question what ground there may be for that relation concerning horns taking root and growing about Goa, he wrote, "Inquiring about this, a friend laughed and told me it was a jeer put upon the Portuguese, because the women of Goa accounted much given to lechery." So despite some of their questions seeming to betray a certain naivety, the examples I've just given, I think, show that the Society's emphasis on personal observations and experience was actually a useful step forward in gathering knowledge of all kinds. Even more welcome than letters from foreign parts were gifts of natural and man-made curiosities sent into meetings from travellers in America or the Indies. These were often added to the rapidly expanding repository or museum, which Spratt called a general collection of all the effects of art and the common or monstrous works of nature. Spratt claimed that the Society had already, in 1667, drawn together into one room the greatest part of all the several kinds of things that are scattered throughout the universe. This was actually rather premature, but the fellows were certainly assiduous collectors, And the collection was later catalogued by Nehemiah Grew and published in 1681. And you can see that that's the book over there in the corner. There was a serious point to all this collecting. Like their attempts to gather together all current knowledge, the theory behind collecting all the several kinds of things was partly so that they could begin to establish a firm foundation on which to build new taxonomies of the natural world. And although the Royal Society's repository never really fulfilled that function, which was possibly because of the randomness through which items actually came into the collection, personal research and collections of individual members such as John Ray, Francis Willoughby and Sir Hans Sloane did much to advance natural history. And there's one example here which is Francis Willoughby's Natural History of Fish. It's open at one of the plates, but if you ever have a chance to look through it, there's a fantastic series of plates which the Royal Society actually sponsored. The repository bears witness to the early society's interest in advancing medical knowledge in every area, from anatomy and surgery to herbal remedies, poisons, and oriental medicine. Many of the questions sent to Vernati and other residents of foreign parts inquired about local plants, minerals, and waters used for medicinal purposes. Travellers often sent back specimens for display and discussion at the Royal Society's meetings. And one of their more unusual gifts was a cabinet sent back by the chief surgeon at Fort St George, which was the East India Company's station at Madras, which is now Chennai. And this was sent back to the Society in 1698. This is the illustration of the contents of the cabinet that was published in the Philosophical Transactions. The cabinet contained instruments and medical preparations used by Oriental surgeons. But judging from the account given in the Philosophical Transactions, the most fascinating objects were the collection of tools contrived for the taking any substance out of the ears, or for the scratching or tickling them, which the Chinese do account one of the greatest pleasures. A full-page diagram, which is this diagram, of the ear instruments. The ear instruments are these ones. These are actually Oriental knives, so hopefully you weren't putting those into your ear. And here we have a Chinese figure, wherein is represented one of that nation using one of these instruments and expressing great satisfaction therein. And that's the Chinese figure. The article concluded with a note of warning though. Whatever pleasure the Chinese may take in thus picking their ears, I'm certain most people in these parts who have their hearing impaired and have advised with me for their help, I have found have had such misfortunes come to them by picking their ears too much, and thereby bringing humours or ulcerous dispositions into them. Other specimens were provided by the Royal Society Fellows themselves. Robert Boyle produced this monstrous head of a colt with a double eye in the midst of its forehead. And Robert Hooke was actually given the colt's head and ordered to make this drawing of it and then do a dissection of it. Following that, John Wilkins donated the skin of a monstrous lamb born in Cambridgeshire, which had 7 legs, 2 bodies, 2 tails, and only 1 head. And John Houghton presented a monstrous chicken hatched with 4 legs at Godalming in Surrey. Robert Plott even sent a description of a monstrous cucumber grown in Canterbury, and it was almost 4 feet long. This fascination with deformities was partly curiosity at the grotesque, but it also served the more scientific function of learning about normal physiology by studying abnormalities. Sometimes discussion of monstrous births at meetings focused on the cause. One opinion, which was current at the time, was that human fetuses were affected by the force of imagination in pregnant women. For example, the mother of Elizabeth Dooley of Kilkenny was frightened by a cow as she milked it and hit with a teat on the left temple, in which very place the girl has a piece of flesh growing exactly like a cow's teat, in bigness, shape, etc. But a more complex discussion followed an account of a lamb born without a mouth. From hence it was questioned how this lamb was nourished in the uterus, it being the received opinion that the fetus takes in its nourishment through the mouth, which Dr. Tyson confirmed by several arguments, instancing particularly an embryo in which he'd found the tongue large and well formed as being necessary for its nourishment, and the legs and arms small and imperfect. Mr. Hooke was of opinion that the blood contributes much to the nutrition of an embryo, and in this case of the lamb there was no doubt made by anyone. So as usual, Hooke was on the right track with that one. It was not only medical curiosities that their correspondence informed Fellows of the Royal Society about. The network of informants extended throughout Britain and Ireland, and any very unusual natural occurrences would eventually be reported to the Society in London, or in fact to the Dublin Philosophical Society or the Oxford Philosophical Society, which were both founded later in the 17th century. And many of these reports were published in the Philosophical Transactions. However, there was a difficulty in the desire to accept information from all sorts of witnesses. It was very difficult to know how far to trust individual accounts. Historians have pointed out some of the ways that the Royal Society tried to combat this difficulty. For example, by always having a number of witnesses at experiments, or it's been suggested by implicitly trusting the word of a gentleman, and most of the fellows would have thought of themselves as gentlemen. However, another way of proving the factual nature of an account was to give as many circumstantial details as possible, including the names of people involved, places, and, if possible, getting a local gentleman as a witness. This gave the impression that anyone reading the account could, if he chose, follow it up by actually going and interviewing the people involved. And this can be seen very clearly in the account of a shower of fish, which was printed in the Philosophical Transactions in 1698. On Wednesday before Easter, 1666, a pasture field at Cranstead, near Wrotham in Kent, which is far from any part of the sea or branch of it, and a place where there are not fish ponds, but a scarcity of water, was all overspread with little fishes, conceived to be rained down, there having been at the time a great tempest of thunder and rain. The fishes were about the length of a man's little finger, and judged by all that saw them to be young whitings. The field belonged to one Ware, a yeoman, who carried some of them to the sessions at Maidstone in Kent, and showed them, among others, to Mr. Lake, a bencher of the Middle Temple, who had one of them and brought it to London. Another account of unusual weather conditions was sent in from Topsham, near Exeter, which experienced a waterspout in August 1694. Mr. Zachary Main not only described the effects of the waterspout, miraculously you'll be pleased to hear no one was hurt, but for extra authenticity he also sent in this small diagram of its destructive path, which was then printed in the Philosophical Transactions. And according to Main, most of the damage was done to the roof tiles of this row of houses, although there was some damage to the boats, and that one was overturned. The fisherman at Mark A witnessed the beginning of the spout and was obviously quite excited by that, but he was also unharmed. Finally, there were some investigations generally carried out by individual fellows rather than the society as a whole that were never going to be particularly practical. The most striking example of this was proposed by Francis Potter, a Somersetshire clergyman. Potter's early claim to fame was the authorship of An Interpretation of the Number 666, which was first published in 1642 and reprinted in 1647. However, Potter's inventive faculty was equally at home with mechanical designs, and in 1663 he sent the Society a description of what he hoped would be a great leap forward, the cart with legs. The challenge of drawing the device from Potter's description clearly appealed to Robert Hooke, whose sketch this is. But Hooke also advised the Society that he thought the cart was of no practical use. Nevertheless, Potter was elected a fellow at the same meeting. Although his cart design was fundamentally unworkable, it did address a problem which intrigued the Society at the time, which was how to transport goods over different kinds of terrain. And presumably the idea of the cart with legs was that the legs could move over stones or ruts, which perhaps would make a wheeled carriage get stuck. But Hooke actually pointed out that there's no way to back this cart up. He thought that the legs would stop working if it was trying to go backwards. So. However, several fellows, including Hooke, came up with new forms of road transport as part of their bid to improve the quality of 17th century life, although as far as I know, none of them were actually put into practice. So just to give a quick conclusion, Thomas Spratt's History of the Royal Society was an apology for the new philosophy, but it was also a call for wider support. He wrote, "I shall here present an account of the Royal Society, in hope that this learned and inquisitive age will either think their endeavours worthy of assistance, or else will be provoked to attempt some greater enterprise for the benefit of human life by the advancement of real knowledge." It's possible that Spratt and the other fellows overestimated the interest in experimentation among most of their contemporaries. It seems that many Londoners, including unfortunately the royal patron himself, Charles II, were actually happier making jokes about the fellows weighing air and investigating fleas than actually trying to assist them in their endeavours. However, as we've seen today, a wide network of correspondence at home and abroad did support the Society, sending them man-made and natural curiosities, answers to questions, reports of interesting phenomena, and suggestions for further research. This collaborative model for experimental research worked extremely well in some respects, allowing men and some women of different interests and capabilities to contribute to a wider endeavour. However, it also meant that some of the contributions were not particularly helpful at the time. This was because, I think, the new philosophers, although they were fairly clear about how they wanted to collect information, that is, they were fairly clear that they wanted to have as wide a circle of correspondence as possible, were not yet fully able to process that information once it appeared. So they weren't quite sure what they should do with it when they received it. And consequently, the advancement of real knowledge took place not only alongside, but I think also through these reports of monsters, waterspouts, showers of fish, and unusually large cucumbers. Thank you.